Thoth proceeded with a being named Ra and Aragat, who were previous kings of Atlantis, and began the experiment. To understand what they did, we have to talk about consciousness grids. A planetary grid is an etheric crystalline structure that envelops the planet and holds the consciousness of any one species of life.
Etherical crystalline structure is an impossibility because etherical is to be without form and crystalline is to have a uniform structure. So this is an oxymoron presented by a moron.
This grid does have an electromagnetic component associated with the third dimension, but it also has a component for every dimension as well. These grids are geometric, of course, and science will eventually discover that there is a grid for every species in the world. Each of these grids have their own geometry and are unique. There's not another one like it, just as the species itself are unique.
Every species has a unique grid system, and then they have one for each dimension. Life has energy, but a planetary grid is dumb. I could fathom if all life added to a single grid, but this concept is lame.
These grids give off light as well, and from space they can be seen as the source of the bluish glow around the Earth.
No. The bluish glow around the Earth is from the atmosphere.
What Thoth and friends had to do was create a synthetic Christ consciousness grid, allowing humans to ascend to Christ consciousness in a very short time.
So the three amigos had to create a fake grid to manifest Christ consciousness. But when the Martians did this building of fake structures, it was the Lucifer experiment and it was evil. I would like to know the difference.
But first, let's talk about the science behind the grid. Perhaps you've heard of the 100th monkey experiment. Over a span of 30 years, scientists were researching a species of monkey called Macaca fuscata on an island in Japan. They were providing the monkeys with sweet potatoes by dropping them in the sand. The monkeys liked sweet potatoes, but they didn't like the sand and dirt so much. A few monkey children figured out that they could wash their sweet potatoes, and some of them taught the technique to their parents. Only a few of the adult monkeys did this though. This went on for some time until one day the monkeys who actually knew the technique hit critical mass. And bingo! The technique started spreading faster than it did before. Monkeys started learning it really easily across all of the Japanese islands nearby as well as on the mainland. They knew that there had to be something that wasn't yet understood about how a species is connected to itself.
The 100 monkey experiment is flawed. Even after 6 years, there were monkeys still not washing the sweet potatoes. 6 years. Also, the maximum size of the colony was 59 monkeys.
In Lesson 11, I showed you the 3 levels of consciousness. Each of these levels have their own consciousness grids around the planet, and our second level grid is based on squares and triangles. Many governments of the world, especially the Russian and US governments, were studying our grids back in the 60s and probably earlier. When mapping out the grid on the planet, you find little military bases on many of the nodal points of the grid. There are tons of these bases way out in the middle of nowhere, like on little islands like Guam.
Guam had a strategic importance, especially in World War II. When you look at the bigger picture, it is important to realize history. Also, some of your points are over water, thus your claim is worthless.
This couldn't be a coincidence that these government powers placed their bases right where the little spirals came out of the grid. They were trying to take control of the grid, because if you control consciousness, you control what we think and feel. Of course, there was another organization that had its hand in both of these governments, and still do, and we will discuss them soon enough. This grid is visible through astral projection as well. 13,000 years ago, it began. Thoth, Ra, and Aragat were to create a global complex that was able to build a synthetic Christ consciousness grid over a 13,000 year time period. The first thing they did was to fly to a place which is now called the Giza Plateau, but back then it was known as the land of Chem. It was also a rainforest back then as well, not desert like it is today. First, they created a grid around the planet 4th dimensionally, and then began to construct it in the physical 3rd dimension. They went to the male energetic axis of the Earth and constructed a complex which today is called the Solar Cross. These men were 6th-dimensional beings at that time and were living at a very high level of consciousness, so whatever they thought happened instantly. It was that simple.
They built a 4th dimensional grid, then a 3rd dimensional grid, and located the male energy North Pole, but were 6th-dimensional beings, and whatever they thought happened instantly. Okay.
According to Thoth, he built the Great Pyramid, not the Egyptian king Cheops. Thoth says that it was built 200 years prior to the pole shift and built very quickly. These pyramids were aligned precisely with both Fibonacci and golden mean spirals emanating from out of the solar cross. Interestingly enough, Edgar Cayce also channeled that the pyramids were constructed in this time. The pyramids were also found to be built from the top down. The stones on top were placed first, which has baffled researchers ever since. Every time more is learned about the pyramids, we move further into dark on understanding how they were formed. If what Thoth says is true, well, that explains everything. From there, Thoth and friends constructed an entire network of temples and structures along this grid fourth dimensionally, placing them on nodes on the new synthetic Christ consciousness grid they were creating. All of them were made with Fibonacci or golden mean spirals, and all of them were mathematically referred back to the solar cross in Egypt through the Great Pyramid. The creation of all of the sacred sites on the planet were no accident. It was a single consciousness that created them all, from Machu Picchu to Stonehenge to Zaghuan, you name it. There are a few exceptions, but most were created by a single awareness as part of a unity consciousness grid. Although the Great Pyramid was done all at once, many of these ancient structures of the world were made fourth dimensionally and slowly dropped in frequency until they manifested on the third dimension over a long period of time.
So these other constructs just materialized into place. Did specific styles of different cultures appear, or were they added later?
Richard Hoagland's research brings this forward, but he wasn't the first either. They showed how one sacred site is extrapolated from another to another to another. A hot topic of discussion right now are ley lines. These are simply geometric relations between sacred sites. Archaeologists are now finding these huge connections between major spiritual sites in the globe.
Ley lines. So Duluth, Minnesota is a place of ley lines. Or were you just using images from various websites?
And now we know why they're connected. These sites had to be built physically so that the Christ consciousness grid could manifest. In a way, think of the physical sites as the wiring of a giant wireless electrical system, and then it needs about 13,000 years of continuous energy flow for it to actually turn on. And just so that you're not left in suspense, yes, the grid was completed. It came to life and is now active, though not really used. Congratulations, Earth! We actually survived. Not only has Thoth told us this in person, but he's also written it down in the Emerald Tablets. These tablets were left in the Great Pyramid thousands of years ago. There are 12 tablets in total, formed from a substance created through alchemical transmutation. They are imperishable, resistant to all elements and corrosion. Their atomic structure is fixed in place, and no change can ever take place. In that respect, they violate the material laws of ionization. These tablets share a great wisdom, and you can read them at over 100 different levels of consciousness, and you will always understand them differently. If you're interested in this stuff, you should definitely consider reading them.
First, there was only one tablet, just one, and it is missing. So all of Patch's claims about it being indestructible and contrary to modern science are bogus. Imagine that.
As you can probably tell, Thoth plays a pretty large role in what happened. Most of this information comes from him. Thoth also provided most of this information about the flower of life and its geometric relationship to consciousness with us, and this stuff is tied intimately to the geometry of the universe.
Sacred geometry is a concept that shapes and patterns hold great power and knowledge. That everything created follows a specific pattern.
Considering the quality and quantity of information that he has shared, it makes you really start considering that this next part can be true. The Great Pyramid has a legendary missing capstone. According to the Emerald Tablets, deep under the Great Pyramid there's a room called the Hall of Records. This room was not built by Thoth and long predates the Atlantean civilization.
I read a translation of the Emerald Tablet. It doesn't say that. If it predates the Atlanteans, does that mean the Nicals or Lemurians built it? Why was the capstone for the important pyramids placed in a room that predated the pyramids?
Within the Hall of Records is the capstone of the pyramid, which is 5.5 inches high, solid gold, and completely holographic image of the Great Pyramid. It has all of the little rooms and everything. However, this leaves us with a 24 square foot piece of the Great Pyramid that's missing. If what Thoth says is true, that missing piece actually belongs to a very special airship that exists on Earth. And the way to the airship is through the Sphinx.
So where does this missing top of the pyramid fit with the airship?
The Sphinx, according to Thoth, is not 12,000 years old, but dates back over 5.5 million years on Earth.
The Sphinx is now 5.5 million years old. Who built it? Why? Where's your proof?
Deep under the Sphinx, about 1 mile down, is a round room with a flat floor and flat ceiling. Inside this room is the oldest synthetic object on Earth. The object is about 2 city blocks in size. It's round like a disc and has a flat bottom and top. It is also only about 3 atoms thick, except for a pattern on the top and bottom which looks like this. This pattern is 5 atoms thick. Thoth says that it's powered by consciousness, thoughts, and feelings, and connects with your own living Merkaba, which means that it becomes an extension of you and your own energy fields. The ship is also intimately connected with the spirit of the Earth, and is the protector for the whole planet. Thoth built the pyramid the way he did to fit with the ship. When on top of the Great Pyramid, it creates this image from above.
So the 3-atom thick airship lands where the missing top of the pyramid belongs. Alrighty then.
The disk ship has a circumference equal to the perimeter of the Great Pyramid. As we discussed in Lesson 11, whenever that ratio appears, life occurs. This ship can only be used by the purest of souls. See, whenever we approach the point in the precession of the equinox where our poles do these shifts, we become very vulnerable. Things often degenerate, and while things become chaotic, there are often other species who wish to take us over.
It always happens. So every 13,000 or 26,000 years, aliens try to take over.
This has always happened, not just with us, but with all evolving consciousness. Every time a takeover seems imminent, a very pure person will find their way to the ship and raise it into the air. The Earth and Sun will connect with that person and give him or her great power. Then, whatever that person thinks and feels will happen.
When a pure person jumps on the sacred airship, they can protect the Earth. Whatever that person thinks will happen. So why didn't any pure person from Atlantis jump on the sacred airship and send those Martians back? Wasn't the Earth threatened with a takeover by them also? You see, Patches, your story doesn't add up. Too many plot holes.
And think about it. If consciousness is the primary core component of the entire planet, does it not make sense that it would have its own defense mechanism? This defense is an airship that plugs into the Earth and the Sun, allowing the Earth to have protection. Our takeover event actually already happened, the same year the Christ grid was activated. The year was 1989, and we were having some troubles with the Greys, a race of ETs who were slowly plotting takeover due to a previous scuffle we were having.
In 1989, the Greys tried to invade the Earth. How did this Peruvian or any other person know this? Patches using the Men in Black.
A very pure woman in Peru made the ascension process into the Christ consciousness grid and found the ship. She tuned it to the frequency of the 4th dimension, where she raised it through the Earth and into the air, and manifested a situation for the Greys to leave. Within a very short time, the Greys began getting sick, and remained sick for as long as they stayed here. They have been forced to leave for now, and we are once again safe. The ship is a warship in that whatever race is trying to take over, the person will just think them away, think up a situation, and force them to leave. Returning to the events on Atlantis, after completing the complex in Egypt, Thoth and pals returned to Atlantis, where they waited for about 200 years until that critical point on the precession of the equinox where the poles would shift. They knew that Atlantis would sink, and they would be ready.
If you knew that a landmass was going to sink, why would you go back? Where were the Martians and the space Hebrews at this time?
Previously on Thoth and Pals.
Thoth, the poles are shifting.
Oh, the pole shift?
Yeah, whoa, what's wrong with your eyes?
I don't know.
When Thoth first saw signs of the polar shift, they returned to the land of Chem and raised the warship into the sky. They went to Atlantis and picked up the Nakals. The Nakals weren't just passengers though, and each and every being was working in unity to create a very powerful Merkaba around themselves and the ship. They returned to the Great Pyramid and landed the ship on top, forming the phi ratio with the pyramid. And then, it happened. The poles began to shift, and human consciousness began to plummet. Simultaneously, the electromagnetic and magnetic fields of the Earth collapsed, and all life on the planet went into the Great Void, the 3.5 days of absolute blackness described by many ancient cultures in the world.
The magnetic field wouldn't collapse. You do not know what causes the magnetic field, apparently. If there was no gravity, the Earth and everything on it would simply separate and float away. How could there be 3.5 days of darkness? Nothing happened to the sun.